I don't normally get into rumour territory, but a persistent story around the Switch successor hardware is the presence of some kind of upscaled Zelda Breath of the Wild game. And while it's perfectly possible that this could purely be a tech demo, a way to model the difference between the Switch original and the new machine's capabilities without revealing any specific games, we must also consider the very real possibility that Breath of the Wild could come to the new console in some form as a full 4K remaster. On the one hand, this seems like a strange idea. Breath of the Wild has shifted over 30 million units so far and continues to outpace all other Zeldas on the Switch, including its own sequel. It is the biggest selling Zelda title ever. To re-release a game that was so recently such a big seller might seem odd. In particular, releasing a game so closely associated with the prior console risks the narrative developing that Nintendo are leaning on past successes with their new console. All the same, I do think there are compelling reasons to consider the possibilities of a Breath of the Wild re-release. First, the fact that it is such a strong seller means that it probably will continue to be in the upper echelons of titles going forward. Mario Kart 8 was a huge deal on Wii U, and while that system's initial install base was a fraction of what the Switch's turned out to be, there was no particular way for Nintendo to know how the Switch might perform when they were developing Deluxe. Granted, if you were to take your best guess, Wii U's 13.56 million units sold seemed like an achievable number to beat, while Switch has more than 10 times that figure as it's turned out. But then again, Breath of the Wild racked up 200,000 sales even in the first quarter of this financial year. If that keeps going, if it maintains that kind of pace for any length of time, and we're already more than 7 years into the system's life, so it shows no sign of stopping, then it represents an excellent entry point into the Legend of Zelda series. Second, we know that there is no new Zelda coming over the horizon for a very long time. It took 6 years and 2 months for Tears of the Kingdom to hit the shelves, and yet every original home console Zelda since Ocarina of Time has taken progressively longer to release, and there's no sign that this pace will increase given the need for the next game to make a more radical step away from the world of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and to do so on a more graphically powerful system, which will require even more development time. And we know that Nintendo likes to have a big iconic entry in its core franchises early in each system. Now, there is a precedent for re-releases, with Wii U offering Wind Waker HD and 3DS offering Ocarina of Time 3D, both titles which once again would be ripe for reinvention given that their re-releases are now older than the originals were when those re-releases first arrived. I do think there is a significant scope for these, and I remain of the view, as explored in a prior video, that it seems likely a major remaster of Zelda Ocarina of Time is on the cards before too long. To this day, Ocarina of Time is one of their most beloved titles, and one which appears to have been hinted at by Eiji Aonuma, who has some form on these matters. However, as fated as Ocarina of Time was, and as much as you can argue with some justification that Ocarina of Time's success was as great as Breath of the Wild if you look at the game's sales in proportion to the install bases of their relative systems, there is no doubting that Breath of the Wild is the high watermark game for Nintendo in terms of sales, and more than that is very much the template game for the new era of Zelda, with Aonuma-san himself commenting in the recent Echoes of Wisdom interview about this. He said then, "Having worked on games in the Legend of Zelda series over the years, we started to feel that fans may not continue playing this franchise unless they can think independently and try various things freely on their own rather than following a set path. Even when it comes to solving puzzles, in a game in the Legend of Zelda series, having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Zelda-like." Now, he's tested this theory with the release of Skyward Sword, surely the arch example of the puzzle box creator-initiated design of puzzles, and while it clearly did okay, 3.91 million sales as of the last update in March 2022, these numbers are dwarfed by Ocarina's 6.44 million on the lower install base of the 3DS, and the 6.46 million sales of Zelda Link's Awakening, albeit another title that was more restrictive than the modern style. Nintendo may feel that they have given both modes of Zelda their due and found the trad style wanting, and while Ocarina of Time is definitely a more promising sales prospect than Skyward Sword ever was given its initial reception, and its return is only a matter of time, I feel, is this the first Zelda game they will want on their next console, the one that will be the first impression of perhaps millions of people who saw the Switch hype from afar but decided to wait for the new system to jump on board. A third reason, of course, is that Breath of the Wild is already on Switch, and so it would be possible to offer these updates to existing players in a clever manner. Now, they don't have to do this. Twilight Princess HD was released on a system more than capable of playing the original Twilight Princess after all, and with more than 8 years almost certain to have elapsed since the original game, we're in the same ballpark as the 9.5 years that it took Skyward Sword to return. If Nintendo simply follow their same formula, the logic dictates that we should celebrate Zelda's 40th in 2026 with a return to the wild that holiday season. But as a goodwill gesture to 30 million fans, offering a paid-for upgrade makes a lot of sense because it is likely to tempt a lot more people to make the upgrade from the Switch to the Switch successor. You see, humans are vulnerable to the sunk cost fallacy, the logical fallacy that means that if you have sunk money into something already, then it's worth spending more money so that it feels like the previous investment was of value and so that a deal is not left on the table. If even 1% of Breath of the Wild Switch players are nudged to try the game on the Switch successor by dint of a relatively low-cost upgrade, the total spend on the Switch successor game will be very significant, and this will only be the start as it will hook people into the Switch 2 ecosystem for potentially very long periods. But more than that, Nintendo get to then keep selling the game as new well into the next decade without having to worry about the old branding, and retailers can focus just on games sporting the new console livery on store shelves. We know that there will be ongoing demand for the game after all, and while their traditional habit has been to take a more withholding, Disney's Vault approach to some of their classic games trapped on old hardware, this strategy does have its limitations. It works if they don't want, let's say, their new Mario game to be in direct competition with the likes of, say, Super Mario Galaxy 2, but if they don't have a new big Zelda game, then why not revive Breath of the Wild? Of course, this raises the question, if this works for Breath of the Wild, why not Mario Kart 8 Deluxe? Why not Super Mario Odyssey? Why not Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and Pikmin 4 and Animal Crossing New Horizon? Now, I may cycle back to this topic another time for a deeper dive if we can get some certainty as to their initial release strategy, but I think the imminence of a sequel title in each respective series will be a major factor. They won't want the new Mario title to be in competition with Odyssey, and while Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has been an almost unimaginably strong seller for them, they will ultimately want to replicate this with a new experience rather than try to eke out sales on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe indefinitely. However, there is a big difference with the Zelda games, which is that the new games don't supersede the old ones in quite the same way. I know there are people with particular affinities for specific versions of Smash and Animal Crossing and Pikmin, but generally speaking, the games build on and supersede the past games, or at least aim to. And even if you are of the view that New Leaf is a stronger title than New Horizons, it's not exactly in Nintendo's interest to advertise this fact. But Breath of the Wild is different because the Zelda games don't just exist as a gameplay experience, but they are also narrative entities to a much larger degree than most Nintendo games. Whether or not the narrative is the primary thing drawing people to the games is immaterial. It gives them more than enough reason to continue supporting extensive remakes of old games on a regular basis. Now look, the day will come that we get another Zelda that really does make the Wild era games look quaint, but we're a long way off that yet, and it's not like affection for Ocarina and Majora dissipated with the release and success of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. So, Will Breath of the Wild return in the Switch successor era? Look, we know that a 4K Breath of the Wild exists, so I think there is a 90% chance we will see it in some form. Even if it's available to Switch players as a download, the prospect of a director's cut or complete edition, including DLC, is such an obvious step that it seems unlikely they will miss it, and I think there's a 70% chance of a physical release of a game including Breath of the Wild, probably also including the DLC as well. The only question then is when? Well, if they're using it as an evergreen title to tide them over until the next Zelda, there is no reason to wait especially, so I'd say the first 2 years of the system being on the market would be a 50% chance. I'm not convinced this makes sense as a launch title. Yes, it would show the difference from the past system, but it seems like an oddly regressive move to re-release your past launch game on your new console, even if, as I'm sure it would be, it's alongside a number of other newer games. I think the only reason to do this would indeed be that they are offering an upgrade program, in which case Breath of the Wild would be showcasing the upgrades rather than being there as a game in its own right. In that case, it might make sense to have it there on day one rather than in a unique slot, as it would be a kind of exemplar, proof of concept title akin to 1-2-Switch on the original Switch, except with a purpose to showcase the system's graphical upgrade capabilities. I'd say at this point a launch window release, the first calendar year let's say, is a 30% chance. What then of Tears of the Kingdom, which seems to have become the red-headed stepchild of the era of the Wild? I certainly don't see them doing a Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom double pack. I would give a 10% chance of this at maximum, given that Nintendo so rarely does this. Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp aside, Super Mario 3D All-Stars is the only example of a first-party title sold only like this in the Switch era, and that was a limited edition title. They did also allow Bayonetta 1 and 2 and Pikmin 1 and 2 to be bought concurrently, but they were still fundamentally separate entities. But both titles, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are so massive that it makes little sense to release both together as retail propositions. They may also feel that they can get more juice out of Tears of the Kingdom by putting a re-release in 2026, around the anniversary of the series. I certainly think if Breath of the Wild is re-released, then Tears of the Kingdom will follow sooner rather than later. And while I take the team at their word that they are done with the game and drawing a line under Tears of the Kingdom, it does seem like a kind of hat tip to novelty, such as incorporating a master mode, would at least give a new version an edge of freshness while they wait for the next big Zelda. And to me, that big Zelda will not only be the next new original game, but also a new Ocarina of Time, something you'll want to check out this video on screen to find out more about. Meanwhile, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.